August 4th, 1914, Victoria Station, London. Margaret Ashford stood on platform 9 watching her husband James adjust his new khaki uniform, the fabric still stiff and unfamiliar on his body. Around them, hundreds of other families crowded the platform in scenes repeated across Britain that summer morning. The band played Tipperary while young men sang along, treating departure like holiday excursion rather than journey into industrialised slaughter. Margaret held their 2 sons, ages 6 and 4, who waved small Union Jacks and asked when father would be home for Christmas. The answer everyone gave was the same. Before the leaves fall, certainly by Christmas, this would be quick adventure. James kissed his wife, ruffled his son's hair, and climbed aboard the train with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He would be dead in 3 months at Ypres. Though no one on that platform could imagine such an outcome on this bright morning filled with flags and music, and certainty that God and righteousness would bring swift victory. The goodbye was cheerful because no one understood what was beginning, what this war would demand, how many of these young men singing on trains would never return. 25 years later, when Margaret's youngest son prepared to leave for France, there would be no bands, no flags, no songs. The goodbye would be quiet, desperate, and informed by terrible knowledge of what war actually meant. The Great War began in an atmosphere of naive enthusiasm that seems incomprehensible in retrospect. Across Europe, millions of men mobilized in August 1914, believing they were embarking on brief, glorious adventure. The send-offs reflected this misconception, featuring celebrations rather than mourning, confidence rather than dread, treating war as sporting event rather than existential catastrophe. Families gathered at train stations to wave goodbye to sons and husbands, expecting reunion within months, unable to imagine the years of mechanized killing that would consume a generation. The British experience was typical of this initial enthusiasm. Recruiting offices were overwhelmed by volunteers, men eager to join before the war ended, and they missed the excitement. Families supported enlistment enthusiastically. Mothers encouraging sons to serve, women presenting white feathers to men not in uniform to shame them into enlisting. The social pressure to volunteer was enormous, reinforced by propaganda posters asking, "What did you do in the Great War, Daddy?" implying that failure to serve would bring lifelong shame. The train station farewells became ritual performances of patriotic duty. Families dressed in their best clothes to see soldiers off properly. Brass bands played martial music and popular songs. Crowds waved flags and cheered as trains departed. Young women gave flowers and kisses to soldiers they didn't know, caught up in romantic notions of warrior heroes departing for glory. The atmosphere was carnival-like, festive rather than sombre, reflecting widespread belief that this would be quick, decisive conflict. The letters soldiers wrote from training camps reinforced the optimistic tone. Men described training as vigorous but manageable, officers as competent, equipment as adequate. They wrote about when they would return, making plans for after the war, discussing what they would do with prize money from captured German equipment. These letters, preserved in archives and family collections, show complete failure to understand what industrial warfare would mean. The cheerful tone persisted even as men shipped to France, right up until they experienced actual combat. The first casualties arrived home in September 1914, just weeks after the optimistic departures. The reality of modern warfare began penetrating civilian consciousness through casualty lists published in newspapers. Families who had waved goodbye cheerfully in August received telegrams in September, informing them of deaths. The disconnect between festive departures and tragic returns created psychological trauma that spread through communities. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas had killed thousands before autumn ended. By 1915, the character of farewells had changed dramatically. Families now understood the risks. Train station scenes became more subdued, fewer bands and flags, more quiet desperation. Mothers clung to sons, wives to husbands, understanding that goodbye might be final. Children, too young to understand death, still waved excitedly while parents fought tears. The romantic enthusiasm of 1914 was replaced by grim determination. Sense of duty, overriding fear but not eliminating it. The social rituals around departure evolved to acknowledge danger. Families held farewell dinners, inviting extended family and friends to celebrate soldiers' service while creating memories in case he didn't return. Churches held special services blessing departing soldiers, praying for their safety and swift victory. Communities organized send-off events, though these became more restrained as casualty lists grew longer. The public performances of patriotism continued, but were shadowed by grief for those already lost. The soldiers themselves understood the reality better than civilians. Men who had survived months in trenches, who returned home on leave before returning to the front, couldn't share what they had experienced. They maintained facades of confidence and normalcy, protecting families from knowledge of what they faced. This protective deception created distance between soldiers and civilians, between those who knew war's reality and those who couldn't imagine it. The farewells became performances where both sides pretended the danger was manageable, death was unlikely, return was certain. The final leave before major offensives carried particular weight. Soldiers knew when large operations were planned, understood, the casualty rates such battles produced. The goodbye before the Somme or Passchendaele carried knowledge that many saying farewell wouldn't survive. Families sensed this too, though details remained secret. These farewells were desperate, filled with things left unsaid because saying them would acknowledge probable death. Men and women clung to each other, trying to memorize faces and voices, creating memories that might have to last lifetimes. The practical aspects of departure included final arrangements that acknowledged death's possibility. Soldiers updated wills, designated beneficiaries for military insurance, arranged for allotment payments to families. These administrative tasks made death's possibility concrete, forcing acknowledgement that the departing soldier might not return. Wives signed papers that would provide income if husbands died. Parents verified that death benefits would be paid. These practical necessities punctured any remaining illusions about war's romance. The photographs taken before departure became precious artifacts. Families posed in studios, soldiers in new uniforms, everyone arranged formally for images that might be all that remained. These photographs, thousands of them preserved in archives and family albums, show young men trying to look brave and older family members trying to hide fear. The formal poses and serious expressions captured moment between peace and war, between life and possible death. Many of these photographs became memorial images, last pictures of soldiers who never returned. The class differences in how families sent soldiers off were stark and largely unacknowledged. Wealthy families could afford elaborate farewells, private railway compartments, expensive gifts and equipment for departing soldiers. Working-class families scraped together what they could, often going into debt to provide soldiers with small comforts or equipment the military should have supplied. Officers departed with fanfare and ceremony, their families confident of their sons' leadership roles and relative safety compared to enlisted men. Working-class soldiers left from crowded platforms, their families understanding that infantry privates faced the highest casualty rates. The role of women in these farewells was carefully scripted by social expectations. Women were supposed to be brave, supportive and confident, sending their men off with smiles rather than tears. The propaganda emphasized women's duty to support the war effort by encouraging enlistment and maintaining morale. Women who expressed reluctance or grief were criticized as unpatriotic. This social pressure forced women to suppress genuine emotions, to perform confidence they didn't feel, to smile while their hearts broke. The psychological cost of this performance was never acknowledged or addressed. Children's experiences of these farewells were particularly traumatic. Young children couldn't understand why fathers were leaving or when they would return. Older children understood the danger, but were expected to be brave like their parents. Many children's last memories of fathers who didn't return were train station platforms, waving goodbye while trying not to cry, confused by adults' mixed signals of pride and barely suppressed grief. These childhood traumas affected the war generation in ways that only became clear decades later. French families said goodbye in villages and small towns, often with whole communities participating in farewells that acknowledged most men from the community were departing simultaneously. German departures featured military precision, organized marches to train stations, formal ceremonies emphasizing duty and honor. American farewells, after U.S. entry in 1917, combined patriotic enthusiasm with more open emotionality, less constrained by British reserve or German formality. The letters exchanged after departure became lifelines connecting soldiers and families. Women wrote constantly, describing daily life, sharing news, maintaining connection across distance and danger. Soldiers responded when possible, though censorship limited what they could share. These letters, millions of them preserved in archives, show families trying to maintain normalcy through correspondence, pretending that separation was temporary and reunion certain. The silence when letters stopped arriving was first sign that soldier had been killed or captured, the absence of correspondence becoming itself a form of communication. The soldiers who returned on leave faced complicated reunions. Families wanted to hear about experiences, but soldiers couldn't or wouldn't share the reality of trench warfare. The homecomings became performances where soldiers pretended normalcy while hiding trauma, and families pretended to believe them. When leave ended and soldiers returned to the front, the farewells were informed by knowledge of what soldiers faced, making them more difficult than initial departures. These subsequent goodbyes lacked any remaining illusions, were pure grief temporarily suspended by necessity of return. By 1918, after 4 years of unprecedented casualties, the farewells had become grim rituals everyone endured because they had to. The enthusiasm of 1914 was unimaginable memory. Families said goodbye knowing the odds, understanding that many soldiers wouldn't survive. The social pressure to be brave and supportive continued, but was honoured more in breach than observance. Women cried openly, men showed emotion previously considered unmasculine, children asked questions adults couldn't answer. The pretense of confidence had been destroyed by casualty lists that touched every family and community. The armistice in November 1918 brought joy, but also complicated grief. Families celebrated the war's end, while mourning those who hadn't survived to see it. The soldiers who returned carried trauma that made them strangers to families who remembered the young men who had departed years earlier. The reunions were as complicated as the farewells had been, marked by grief for who soldiers had been, and uncertainty about who they had become. The interwar years saw veterans and families processing these experiences through memory and commemoration. Memorials were erected in every town and village, listing names of those who hadn't returned. Remembrance Day. Rituals institutionalized grief, creating annual ceremonies where communities collectively mourned. But individual families carried private griefs that public ceremonies couldn't fully address. The mothers, wives, and children who had said goodbye at train stations carried those memories for decades, remembering last words, final embraces, moments that had seemed ordinary at the time but became precious because they were last. September 3rd, 1939. King's Cross Station, London. Sarah Bennett stood with her son Thomas, 20 years old, wearing the same type of khaki uniform his uncle had worn at the same station 25 years earlier. But this farewell was completely different from 1914. No bands played, no flags waved, no crowds cheered. Sarah and Thomas stood quietly among other families, all understanding exactly what was beginning because they had lived through it before. Sarah had been 12 when her own father departed in 1915 and never returned. She had watched her mother's grief, had felt the absence that never healed. Now she was sending her son into the same machinery that had consumed her father. Thomas didn't speak of glory or quick victory. He held his mother silently, both understanding that survival was matter of probability rather than certainty, that this war would be as terrible as the last, perhaps worse. When the train pulled away, Sarah didn't wave or smile. She stood watching until the train disappeared, then walked home, to wait, to hope, to fear. This was the last goodbye informed by terrible knowledge, stripped of illusions, pure grief temporarily postponed but never avoided. World War II began without the naive enthusiasm that had characterized 1914. The generation saying goodbye in 1939 remembered 1914's departures and what had followed. They understood that modern war meant industrial-scale killing, that many who departed wouldn't return, that those who survived would carry trauma. The farewells reflected this knowledge, were sombre rather than celebratory, desperate rather than confident, marked by grief that couldn't be hidden behind patriotic performance. The British experience of 1939 contrasted starkly with 1914. Families gathered at train stations but without bands or flags. The mood was resigned rather than enthusiastic. Grim determination replacing earlier enthusiasm. Mothers who had been children in the Great War now sent their own sons off, understanding the risks because they had experienced the losses. The cycle of grief repeated itself, generation after generation fed into war's machinery. The evacuation of children added another layer of goodbye to British experience. Before combat even began, families said goodbye to children being evacuated from cities to countryside, protection against expected bombing. These farewells, children torn from families and sent to live with strangers, were additional trauma layered onto war's other separations. Some families wouldn't reunite for years, children and parents becoming strangers to each other, another cost of modern warfare's total mobilization. The American entry into World War II, after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, created different farewell dynamics. American families had less direct experience of modern war's horror, though World War I veterans remembered and tried to warn their sons what to expect. The farewells combined patriotic enthusiasm, particularly in immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, with knowledge that the war would be long and costly. American families said goodbye understanding that soldiers might be gone for years. might serve in distant theatres, might face dangers beyond imagination. The draft changed how soldiers departed. Unlike 1914's volunteers who chose to enlist, World War II soldiers were often conscripted, departing because law required it rather than patriotic enthusiasm. This involuntary aspect changed the character of farewells. Families sent off sons and husbands who had to go, not who wanted to go, adding resentment and fear to grief. The goodbye was complicated by anger at circumstances forcing separation, at war that seemed inevitable but unwanted. The military's organisation of departures was more systematic than in World War I. Induction centres processed draftees efficiently, creating assembly line farewells where individual grief was subordinated to administrative necessity. Families were given limited time to say goodbye before soldiers were processed and sent to training camps. This bureaucratic efficiency served military purposes, but denied families the time and space to properly acknowledge separations that might be permanent. The training camp system meant multiple farewells. Soldiers departed first for basic training, usually within the United States, allowing families to visit or see them off again before overseas deployment. This staged departure process extended the goodbye over months, each stage marking progression toward combat and increasing danger. Families might drive soldiers to training camps, have final weekends together before overseas deployment, creating multiple last memories rather than single farewell. The photographs and letters became more sophisticated than in World War I, but served similar purposes. Families took countless photographs, capturing soldiers in uniform, family, gatherings, everyday moments that might become precious memories. Soldiers carried photographs of families, displaying them in lockers and barracks, maintaining visual connection across distance. The letters flowed constantly, facilitated by improved mail systems, maintaining emotional bonds while soldiers were deployed. The USO shows and entertainment created different send-off atmosphere than World War I. Hollywood stars performed for troops, creating glamorous departures that contrasted with grim realities awaiting soldiers overseas. These performances served morale purposes but also created cognitive dissonance, entertainment masking danger. Soldiers departed from shows featuring beautiful actresses and famous entertainers, then travelled to combat zones where mortality was constant companion. The racial segregation of American military created different farewell experiences for black soldiers. African American families sent sons off to fight for country that denied them equality. Defending democracy abroad while experiencing discrimination at home, these farewells carried additional layers of complexity. Pride in serving, anger at injustice, fear not just of enemy but of racism within American military itself. Black soldiers departed understanding they faced dangers from both enemies and supposed allies. Women's increasing military service created new types of farewells. Women joining WACs, Waves, Army Nurses Corps, and other service branches departed for war, reversing traditional gender roles. Families said goodbye to daughters, wives, and mothers, adapting farewell rituals designed for men to new reality of women in combat zones. These departures challenged social expectations while maintaining emotional intensity of any war farewell. The Pacific Theater created particular dread for American families. The distance was vast, communication would be limited, and Japanese military culture's reputation for brutality terrified families sending soldiers there. The farewell before Pacific deployment carried knowledge that this theatre would be particularly brutal. That Japanese refusal to surrender meant high casualty rates, that conditions would be primitive and dangerous. These farewells were desperate, families understanding the specific horrors awaiting soldiers in Pacific combat. The European theatre departures carried different fears, shaped by knowledge of Nazi atrocities and Axis military capabilities. Families sending soldiers to Europe understood they would face sophisticated enemy with modern weapons and experienced troops. The spectre of D-Day and other major operations hung over these farewells, everyone knowing that massive casualties would accompany any invasion of occupied Europe. The families of bomber crews faced unique situations. Strategic bombing required repeated missions over heavily defended targets, cumulative risk that meant most bomber crews wouldn't complete required mission totals before being killed or captured. Families saying goodbye to bomber crew members understood the statistical reality. Their sons and husbands probably wouldn't survive. These farewells carried knowledge of probability, mathematical certainty that many wouldn't return, making goodbye especially desperate. The home front mobilization meant families remained involved in war effort after soldiers departed. Women took factory jobs, children collected scrap metal, communities organized civil defense, everyone contributed. This continued involvement provided purpose and distraction, gave families feeling they were helping soldiers they had said goodbye to. The victory gardens, war bond drives, and rationing created shared sacrifice that connected home front to fighting front. The casualties arrived throughout the war, telegrams delivered by officers or Western Union messengers becoming symbols of grief. The families who had said goodbye at train stations received news that soldiers wouldn't return. That farewells had been final, the accumulated grief of World War II casualties, though proportionally lower than World War I for most nations, except Soviet Union and Germany, still marked every community. The fear of receiving telegram haunted every family with soldiers deployed. The wounded returned home, creating complicated reunions. Soldiers with visible injuries faced families' shock and grief. Those with psychological trauma, what was beginning to be recognized as combat fatigue or shell shock, faced families who couldn't understand invisible wounds. The reunions for wounded soldiers were marked by relief they had survived, but grief for what they had lost. Limbs, health, psychological wholeness. These weren't the simple, happy reunions everyone hoped for, but complicated encounters between changed people. The German home front experience showed costs of losing. German families said goodbye to soldiers throughout the war, initially with confidence of quick victory, later with growing desperation as tide turned against Germany. By 1944, German families sent soldiers off knowing defeat was likely, that many wouldn't survive, that those who did would return to destroyed homeland. The farewells became increasingly desperate, final embraces before departures that everyone understood might lead to death or Soviet captivity. Both fates Germans feared tremendously. The Soviet experience was marked by total war's complete mobilization. Entire communities were mobilized, men and women, soldiers and factory workers, everyone contributing to war effort. The farewells were brief and frequent, soldiers departing for front that might be kilometers away, families remaining in cities under siege or threat. The Soviet casualty rates, unprecedented in modern warfare, meant most families lost someone, making grief universal rather than exceptional. The Japanese home front combined traditional culture with modern warfare's demands. Families said goodbye to soldiers departing for Pacific, China, or Southeast Asia, with rituals emphasizing duty and honor. The expectation that soldiers would die rather than surrender created farewells that acknowledged death as likely or certain outcome. Japanese families performed ceremonies blessing soldiers, giving them ritual items to carry, creating spiritual protection for journeys they understood would likely end in death. The kamikaze pilot farewells were extreme versions of this. Final ceremonies where everyone acknowledged pilot would die, making goodbye explicit acceptance of certain death. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. Families who had said goodbye years earlier finally received word that soldiers were coming home. But the reunions were complicated by what soldiers had experienced and who they had become. The person returning wasn't identical to the person who had departed. Combat changed soldiers in ways families couldn't understand. The reunion after years of separation required families to rebuild relationships with people who looked familiar, but felt like strangers. August 15, 1945, victory over Japan. American families celebrated the war's end while mourning those who hadn't survived to see it. The final accounting showed over 400,000 American dead, each one representing families who had said goodbye and never been able to properly say hello again. The grief was personal and national simultaneously, individual families' losses combining into collective tragedy that marked the generation. The post-war processing of these farewells shaped how the war was remembered and commemorated. The Greatest Generation mythology emphasized heroism and sacrifice, often glossing over the terror and grief that had accompanied actual farewells. The propaganda image of confident soldiers and supportive families masked the reality. Desperate goodbyes, suppressed fears, grief temporarily postponed but never eliminated. The actual human experience was more complicated and painful than official memory acknowledged. The families who had sent soldiers off twice, in both world wars, carried unique perspective. They understood the cycle of separation, fear, and loss that war created. Many became advocates for peace, understanding from personal experience what war cost families. Others accepted war as inevitable, tragic but necessary. But all carried memories of train station platforms, final embraces, last words that echoed for decades. The children who said goodbye to fathers in World War II and never saw them return carried trauma that shaped their entire lives. Growing up without fathers, knowing they had died in distant countries for causes children couldn't fully understand, these children of war carried grief that never fully healed. The absent father became a permanent fixture in their lives. Memory and imagination rather than living presence, shaping identity and psychology in ways that persisted for lifetimes. The wives who said goodbye to husbands faced years of uncertainty, followed by either joyful reunion or devastating loss. The women who received telegrams informing them of husbands' deaths faced futures they hadn't planned for. Raising children alone, carrying memories of final farewells that became more precious as years passed. These war widows, thousands of them, rebuilt lives while carrying grief for partnerships ended by war. The mothers who sent multiple sons to war faced accumulated fear that multiplied with each departure. Some families lost multiple sons. Grief compounded by grief, farewells repeated until each goodbye carried weight of all previous losses. The Gold Star mothers, women who lost sons in service, formed organizations to support each other, shared grief, creating community of those who understood loss that others couldn't imagine. The comparison between World War I and World War II farewells revealed evolution in how societies understood and processed war's human cost. The naive enthusiasm of 1914 was absent in 1939, replaced by grim knowledge of what war meant. But both wars required same fundamental sacrifice. Families sending loved ones into danger, saying goodbye without knowing if they would meet again, carrying fear and grief throughout conflicts that seemed endless while they lasted. The technology of memory evolved between wars. World War I families had photographs and letters. World War II families added recordings, home movies, more sophisticated documentation of soldiers' lives before departure. But the fundamental emotional experience remained unchanged. Saying goodbye to someone who might die remained terrifying regardless of whether you had photograph or film to remember them by. The technology of memory couldn't ease the grief of loss or the fear of final goodbye. The legacy of these farewells shaped post-war generations. The baby boomers, children of World War II veterans, grew up in shadow of parents' war experiences. Some veterans shared their experiences, trying to help children understand what they had survived. Others remained silent, unable or unwilling to discuss trauma they had experienced. But all carried memories of farewells, either ones they had experienced or ones their parents had described, shaping how they understood family, loyalty, sacrifice, and loss. In the end, the story told in farewells, from World War I's naive enthusiasm to World War II's grim knowledge, captured the human cost of industrial warfare. The families who gathered at train stations, who embraced soldiers knowing it might be last time, who maintained brave faces while hearts broke, experienced war's most fundamental tragedy. The separation of people who loved each other, forced by circumstances beyond their control, sustained by hope that reunion would come while fearing it wouldn't. The goodbye, whether cheerful in 1914 or desperate in 1939, whether to volunteer or draftee, whether believing war would be quick or knowing it would be long, remained the same fundamental experience. Families torn apart by war, holding each other tightly before letting go, trying to memorize faces and voices, saying words that might be last, creating memories that would have to sustain them through years of separation or lifetimes of grief. The last goodbye, repeated millions of times across 2 world wars, told the truest story of war's cost. Not just the dead, but the living who lost them, who carried memories of final embraces, last words, train platforms and bus stations where families broke apart, some temporarily, some forever, all changed by the experience of saying goodbye without knowing if they would ever say hello again.